Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. And today we're going to be doing the ideal Beethoven symphony cycle. Oh, wow. Is this going to be a thrill? I guarantee it. Now, before we do that, I want to sort of set out the rules of the game so that you understand what we're doing and it makes sense in terms of everything. Now, from my personal standpoint, I do these ideal cycle things where I do not repeat a single conductor, and I try not to repeat a single orchestra if I can. Why? Because my whole intention is to try and show you the variety of interpretations available. When I do talks about individual works, and I've already done a talk about the best Beethoven cycles, obviously we're going to be dealing with a single orchestra mostly, or a single conductor mostly. So we don't have to deal with that. This is just the opposite approach. And I really want to emphasize how many different ways there are to get into the repertoire, to enjoy the music. And, some of you have said, oh boy, Beethoven's going to be difficult because there's so much stuff. No, it's just the opposite. That makes it easy. When you're as popular as Beethoven, you've got dozens of excellent recordings of just about everything. And it's just a question of picking the ones that you want. Remember, the idea here is not to say that any specific recording is the best in the universe. I do that in the other talks about the specific works. No, the idea here is to pick an entire cycle in which there are no weak links. In other words, every single performance is superb from start to finish, and that's what I've done. And so I want to get right down to the brass tacks and start talking about the ideal, cosmically, absolutely, perfectly ideal Beethoven cycle. Or at least one of about 3 dozen you could probably do yourself. So here we go. Are you ready? Symphony number 1. Well, now, Symphony number 1 is the symphony that has Beethoven's sort of early debt to Haydn and Mozart most prominently displayed. And so for that reason, it's the one that works really best when you have a performance that takes the period instrument approach. Whether it's on period instruments or not, it works really, really well with that kind of bright, perky, quick tempos, lots of trumpets and drums, something that really makes it sound, on the one hand, like its classical forebears, but on the other hand, as something fresh and new and even radical in its excitement and energy and impulse, because that's really what it brings. That's what it has. And so for that reason, I have chosen Paavo Järvi with the whatever you call it. Yes, the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie Bremen, the German Chamber Philharmonic of Bremen, Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie Bremen. This happens to be a first-class Beethoven cycle. In fact, all of these performances, or most of them, come from first-class Beethoven cycles. Most of them, not all. And this is a great performance. These early symphonies, particularly in this cycle, are astonishing. They are magnificently played and wonderfully well recorded and just exciting as hell. And that's what you want in a really great first symphony. However, once we get to the second symphony, I'm putting this little booky thing away, the universe changes. Changes considerably, really, because Beethoven is on his way to a new style of his own. You may recall that the Second Symphony got terrible reviews when it first came out. There's a great one in the Lexicon of Musical Invective where it's called a hideously writhing wounded dragon, a monstrosity, Beethoven's second? Yeah, it's really quite a big work when you think about it. It's longer than like the fourth or the eighth. It's a big symphony, especially the slow movement, the largo. And for that reason, I prefer versions of the second that are not in the period instrument style. In fact, none of the rest of them will be in the period instrument style, at least in this particular ideal cycle. And I really think that the second should begin to show Beethoven as foreshadowing the larger things to come. And for me, the great modern performance that does that is Daniel Barenboim with the Staatskapelle Berlin. Remember this cycle? I mean, when this came out, everyone was over the moon. Everyone was so excited about it. Now no one mentions it at all. That's what's happened in the industry. There's just so much stuff out there that it's impossible to keep track of it. And we forget things as soon as they're released. Of course, the fact that it was deleted as soon as it's released and then has been reissued since in like boxes and other ways, doesn't help it. But it is a great, great Beethoven cycle. It is a fabulous tribute to that German tradition, that grand German tradition of Furtwängler and those people. Although, unlike Furtwängler, Barenboim can get the orchestra to actually play the music, and it sounds great. And it was really an astonishing achievement. And the Second Symphony is grand. It's grand and it's exciting too. It's not dull. It's not stodgy, but it's already Beethovenish. It has that sense of struggle, that cosmic Olympian quality in the Largo. It's a gorgeous performance, absolutely gorgeous. And it makes the second into sort of an event all by itself, which it really should be, because each one of these symphonies has something special. And you want a performance that realizes those special qualities, that make it completely satisfying in and of itself. So that's the second. Next, we come to the Eroica. Oh boy, the Eroica. Now I have to confess, I don't really like the Eroica. I've never liked the Eroica. I think the funeral march is too long and dull, and I think that the entire symphony is badly orchestrated. I think that the scoring is too small for the dimensions of the music. To do the Eroica well requires an amazing conductor. It really does. Not that there haven't been wonderful performances of it. There are many wonderful performances. But for me, it's not a symphony that plays itself. I don't enjoy it unless the performance is one of those really superb ones. Anything less than the highest level, I have no patience for, because it's too long and it instantly turns boring to me. I mean, it can be a breathtaking and shattering piece, but for me, it's a problematic piece. It really, really is. And so I want to hear a performance that convinces me, that really makes the case for it. Now, I know others may find that a heretical notion, but that's just the way I feel about it. It's always struck me that way. And, when I hear people talk about how radical and revolutionary it is, it doesn't sound that way now. It doesn't sound that way to us now. We know it. We know it by heart. And so all of that revolutionariness and Napoleon and the biographical crap that comes with it doesn't interest me. All I hear is the music itself. And the music itself is not difficult, and it's not all that shocking. And there's that wonderful moment, at the recapitulation that everybody talks about, how you have the tonic comes in on the wrong harmony, and the horn comes in, and it caused hysteria in Beethoven's day. Everyone was like, oh, it's got to be a mistake. They corrected the string tremolo. Who even notices it now? Our ears are just used to it. We cannot go back and hear this music the way Beethoven's audiences heard it. And so a performance, for me, in this day and age, has to not recapture the radical notion and the radical concept of the symphony. You can't. It's impossible. It's gone. Poof. Gone. What it needs to do is make the case for the music qua music, as great music, and not be boring. And that seems to be a tall order, because people tend to get lost in the quasi-programmatic aspects of the work. And so, enough of my BSing about it. The performance I have chosen is a new one. I could have chosen Klemperer. I could have chosen Zell. I could have even gone for one of the cranky old Furtwänglers. I mean, some of them are great. There are wonderful, wonderful Eroicas out there. There really are. I mean, Bernstein did a great Eroica. Lots of people did great Eroicas. But the one I've chosen is Manfred Honeck and the Pittsburgh Symphony on reference recordings. Now, this is, I think, the Eroica for the 21st century. It is stunning. It is amazing. It is absolutely astoundingly great. And I think, one of the things that convinced me about it, I haven't reviewed this yet at classicstoday.com. I haven't. I've sat on this recording for like a year and a half because I didn't want to say anything about it until I really internalized it and got to know it. And because the Eroica is such a difficult work for me, I don't play it that often. I have to be in the mood, So I really gave it time. And I am absolutely convinced that it's as great an Eroica as any that have ever been recorded. And one of the things that sort of convinced me is that the first time I heard it, I said, wow, it's so exciting. There's so much care and attention given to accentuation, to keeping the music moving, to keeping it startling and fresh. And then when I read the notes by Honeck, he says, oh, I paid special attention to accentuation, to keep the music startling and fresh. Well, yes. I mean, there's nothing more enjoyable than noting something and then knowing that that's what the performers were actually doing. And that's what you hear in this Eroica. It is greatness personified and a heartwarming reminder that we are the era of great performances is not behind us. It is not. There is always something fabulous on the horizon to look forward to and a reason to keep on listening. So Honeck, Pittsburgh, Eroica, go for it. It's a singleton performance. You don't have to buy a cycle. So if you haven't heard it, you damn well better. You owe it to yourself to hear it. It is absolutely amazing. It truly, truly is. And now we come to the fourth. The fourth, in my view, is one of the most misunderstood of the Beethoven symphonies. Everyone talked, remember Schumann's stupid comment about, oh, it's a slender Norse maiden between two Greek gods or some sort of, oh God, it was an idiotic remark. The fourth is a wonderful, muscular, virile piece of music. It really is. It's the work, Tovey even said it, it's the work in which Beethoven solved the movement problem. The idea of conveying constant, energetic motion in music. And the fourth has that. It shows it, and Beethoven never lost that quality once he acquired it. The Eroica has that problem. It has a movement problem. That's why the finale is a theme of variations. It's sectionalized. It doesn't flow in the same way that the fourth does. In the fourth, everything is fluid. Everything is moving like as if it's self-propelled. And the performance has to do that. The performance has to have strength. It has to have rhythmic strength, rhythmic tension, and throughout. And the performance I've chosen, there are quite a few that are excellent. But this one was brought to my attention by my colleague up in Montreal, Christophe Huss, who's the music critic at Le Devoir. And he said to me, I was just listening to Joachim's Beethoven Fourth with the Berlin Philharmonic on Deutsche Grammophon, and it's amazing. Listen to it, because again, it's in a box, you pay attention, you listen, so many performances. So I went and I put it on, and he was right. And so my fourth for this ideal Beethoven cycle is Eugen Joachim with the Berlin Philharmonic. It is a smoker of a performance, one totally unexpected. In other words, nobody ever pays attention to it. Nobody notices the fourth anyway, most of the time, very seldom. And this earlier Joachim Beethoven cycle, he did two others. He did one with the Concertgebouw, then he did one with the London Symphony for EMI. So you've got so much to choose from one guy alone. So which one are you going to play? Well, this is a great, 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 great fourth. And one of the problems, I think, with our current insanity in the Beethoven and general classical music discography and basic repertoire is that there are so many great recordings of these works out there that some real gems get buried. They're just buried. And when are you going to find them unless you happen upon them by chance, as I did this one, quite frankly. So a great Beethoven Fourth, and I'm so happy to include Joachim because he was such a great conductor, such an undervalued conductor to this day. And so that makes me very happy. And now we come to the fifth. Ooh, the fifth. Possibly the most famous piece of classical music in the history of the universe. Well, there are many fifths. And I'm not picking Carlos Kleiber with the Vienna Philharmonic, which has never impressed me as much as it's impressed other people, I think. I respect it. I think it's a very, very good fifth, but I think that there are many better ones. And I think, above all, there are more characterful ones. Kleiber always strikes me as someone who's very, very disciplined, but somewhat faceless. He doesn't have a lot of personality in his interpretations. They're very strict, like his father's, actually, who also, I think, did an even better fifth than Carlos did. But my choice for the fifth is totally different. Igor Markevich with the L'Amoureux Orchestra, because, as you know, Beethoven was really French. The modern orchestra, as we know it, as I've said before in my talk on Karl Schuricht, which I advise you to go see, have a look if you want, is that, and his Beethoven cycle is de rigueur, as a cycle. When we talked about Beethoven cycles, I talked about that. The modern symphony orchestra, the first modern symphony orchestra was the Paris Conservatory Orchestra that was founded in 1828 by Francois Habeneck for the express purpose of playing Beethoven in France. And the tradition of Beethoven performance in France was the longest and most continuous in all of Western history. There isn't anyone in Vienna or Germany or anywhere else that comes anything close to the tradition of Beethoven performance in France. And Beethoven playing in France with real French orchestras, trained in the real French style, as the L'Amoureux Orchestra, especially at this time in the early 60s, as they were, was fabulous. Absolutely fabulous. Not only is this a great fifth because Markevich is a genius as a conductor, a brilliant, brilliant conductor. I mean, he wrote a whole book on how to perform the Beethoven symphonies and published his own editions of the scores. I mean, people don't realize that. I have them over there. I can show you. I mean, they're wonderful with analyses and the whole deal. And it was translated into French and German. I mean, Markevich knew his Beethoven. But beyond that, the fifth has that great triumphant finale. It's that kind of French revolutionary music that people talk about, the Eroica in connection with, but it really doesn't apply to the Eroica. It really applies to the fifth and the finale of the fifth, which is parade ground marching Marseillaise music, and the L'Amoureux Orchestra plays it that way. I mean, the brass just ring out and they all go nuts, and it's just fantastic. So if you can get this Igor Markevich Beethoven fifth, this is a Japanese Deutsche Grammophon, but you may be able to find it more easily. You got to hear it. It's a knockout. It's absolutely a knockout. Now, the Pastoral Symphony. Oh, there are a bunch of good pastoral symphonies too, but the one I chose is, it's just a sentimental favorite. Klemperer. First of all, you got to have a Klemperer. You got to have a Klemperer for his music making was always called granitic, like granite, like hewn from stone. But I picked the Pastoral because, first of all, it has a really slow scherzo. There's a whole story about that, where Walter Legg, the producer, said to Klemperer, "Don't you think you should take the scherzo a little faster?" And Klemperer said, "You'll get used to it." And then while he was actually performing it, he put his baton down and stopped the orchestra and said, "Hey, Walter, you used to it yet?" It was great. But beyond that, the Pastoral Symphony is about woodwind writing. It's all about the woodwinds. And Klemperer loved woodwinds. All of his performances have very forwardly balanced woodwinds. And even though it's a slow performance on the whole, you get the first movement exposition repeats, you get all the repeats in the scherzo. The tempi are leisurely, but the freshness is extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary throughout the performance. It really is. And the slow movement really flows. It's about 13 minutes. It's a little bit on the slow side, maybe a hair. But because you have the exposition repeat in the first movement, the two, they balance perfectly. It's a great, great interpretation of the Pastoral Symphony, and one that's full of character and individuality and personality. It sounds like no other version out there. And so as both an example of Klemperer's inimitable way with Beethoven and a great, great conception of the pastoral, I go with Klemperer on EMI, now Warner, with the Philharmonia. Doesn't get better. Now we get to the seventh. Oh, the seventh is a toughie. Tough symphony to play. There have been not as many great versions of the seventh as there are some of the others, the other popular symphonies. It's a difficult work to bring off. And I think for the combination of Dionysiac fury that the music requires in the outer movements, and ensemble discipline, and that wonderful open sonority with the horns ringing out on the top, and there's the allegretto, the slow movement, which is Beethoven's possibly his most famous slow movement. I mean, it was the Easter Beagle, Charlie Brown. It was a soundtrack. It's been played forever. It's gorgeous, but it's marked allegretto. I mean, technically, the seventh has no real slow movement. And finding the right pace for everything is a job. And the guy who gets that job done better than anybody else, George Zell with the Cleveland Orchestra. You knew he was coming somewhere. I really should have chosen him for the Eroica, possibly because his is the great Eroica before, I think, Manfred Honeck came along and gave him a good run for his money, because nobody did the Eroica as well as Zell did. But boy, the seventh is a stunner. It's a stunner. It is absolutely perfect in every detail and expressive. I mean, expressively meaningful. It has the best performance of the allegretto that you are ever going to hear, in terms of balance between its two melodies, in terms of overall pacing. It's extraordinary, just extraordinary. And so I would definitely go for Zell in Cleveland with the Beethoven seventh, and you will be very, very happy. Now we come to the eighth. The eighth is a bit of a problem child, as some of you may know. First of all, it's funny. It's very funny. And that means that it's mostly misunderstood. It's Beethoven's shortest symphony, and it was written in tandem with the seventh. And it's interesting to sort of hear them next to each other, because they're really mirror images. You know, the seventh is open and expansive. It has a whole new concept of scoring, an expanded range throughout the orchestra. You know, the textures are aerated and brilliant and sort of almost Copland-esque. It has that outdoors feel to it. The eighth is just the opposite. The eighth comes across as one giant orchestral tutti. I mean, you would almost be hard-pressed to find moments where there are solos for instruments. It has a lot of them, but that's not how it sounds while it's playing. It's like one furious, coiled explosion for the entire orchestra. And so a great performance of the eighth, I think, first of all, has to make sense of the scoring. It has to be able to let you hear all of the layers of texture that Beethoven writes into it, even though it sounds very dense. It's very compact. Everything about the piece is compact in its size, in its form, in its handling. It's also like the seventh. It has no slow movement, but it's very, 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 very dense. And I think one of the performances that just gives that density, a sort of timbral fascination that you don't hear anywhere else, is Paul Kletzky with the Czech Philharmonic. This is a great Beethoven cycle too. It's one that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it's famous as much for the orchestra, the classic vintage Czech Philharmonic, which sounds like no other ensemble in the world in this music. They have the most amazing woodwind section. They have sort of lean strings. They're very similar to the French sound, the L'Amoureux Orchestra or the Paris Conservatory Orchestra under Schuricht. It's that kind of a sound. Everything is transparent. Everything has its own individual color, and they don't blend. I don't mean they don't blend in a bad way. I mean they don't congeal. You don't ever get glop. And that does wonders in the Eighth Symphony. You hear details in this performance of the Eighth that you'll hear nowhere else. And it's just a question of color. They make the score sound so kaleidoscopically colorful. It's just wonderful to listen to. It's a joy. And it will not only make you listen to the Eighth with completely fresh ears, but it is the kind of performance that I think will really, if you haven't been fond of the Eighth, if you haven't really gotten into its special world, then Kletzky and the Czech Phil are the guys who will do it for you. I guarantee it. It's just amazing. Now we come to the ninth, and you'll have to bear with me for a moment. Wait a second here. As you can see, I'm wearing my formal t-shirt. And as I've said many times, when we discuss the ninth, because it is the most iconic monument to symphonic sublimity in all of Western music, it is always necessary that we dress appropriately. And so, of course, we must have a cravat, a tie, when we talk about the Ninth Symphony. Otherwise, anything we say will be considered terribly impertinent. I mean, it's just not done. So now we are ready to discuss the Ninth. Now, in my talk on the best Beethoven Ninth, I mentioned my favorite was Günter Wand. Now, you may note, I think I said he's the best Beethoven cycle generally also. So I haven't mentioned any of Günter Wand's performances of Beethoven in this particular talk, but I could have mentioned a lot of them because they're all great. They're terrific. But nope, we are not talking about Günter Wand, and I am not talking about his Ninth. I'm talking about one of the Ninths that a lot of you mentioned that I hadn't discussed because there were availability issues and whatnot, but that's okay. I don't care. It's actually available fairly easily if you have a Japanese source. But Schmidt-Isserstedt with the Vienna Philharmonic. This has always been one of the handful, I mean, literally 5 or 6 great, great, great Ninths. Always. And it tends to get lost in the shuffle. It's like the great Ninth that nobody talks about. And I think the reason is because, of course, Schmidt-Isserstedt was not the most famous of conductors. And second of all, it hasn't been kept available in a way which is helpful. Although you can get it used very easily. It was on a cheapy Decca, like weekend classics thing. So it's easy to find. It has the absolute best soloists ever in the Ninth. The soloists are, get this, Joan Sutherland, Marilyn Horne, James King, and Marty Talvela. I mean, you don't get better soloists. Now, nobody really cares about the soloists in the Ninth. I mean, I know some of you will say, I do. I don't care. I don't care. Let's put it that way. And if I don't care, nobody cares. And beyond that, the solo writing is hideously difficult and hideously ugly. So the quicker you get it over with, the better. But when you have a team that's this good, you actually might not dread the entry of the soloists in the finale, and especially in that ghastly cadenza before the big final in the coda, and they're all going, ooh, Flugelfeld. I mean, oh God, it's horrible. I mean, Beethoven was definitely deaf, but we don't care because, boy, do they sing the living daylights out of it. But the performance itself, in all respects, with the Vienna Philharmonic in top form and a conductor who has just has the work, understands it, and projects it effortlessly with complete and total command, makes this the capstone of my ideal Ninth cycle. And I really wish that Decca would re-release the entire Schmidt-Isserstedt Beethoven cycle because it is marvelous. It is absolutely marvelous. So there you have it. The ideal Beethoven cycle. Wasn't that easy? It wasn't difficult at all. It really wasn't. There's lots of Beethoven out there. And I know that you will want to pick your own. And this time, folks, I really want you to try and do it. I know some of you have argued, I want to duplicate conductors. Let me tell you something. If you have to duplicate a conductor to come up with an ideal Beethoven cycle, then you shouldn't be choosing. You really shouldn't be because there's so much stuff out there for you to pick from. And I'll bet most of you have a favorite Beethoven cycle. And for those of you who are starting out and who haven't gone through this whole process and who find, some of the geekdom and the bewildering list of names and labels and performers, intimidating, don't be. Don't be, because the standard of performance, especially in Beethoven these days, historically, is so high. There's so much to choose from that it's really difficult to go wrong. You don't have to worry about getting ripped off unless you get something, unless you're really not paying attention. But between this talk and the talk on symphony cycles, and then the talks to come on individual works, I've already done the Ninth Symphony. We're going to get through all of them at some point. You will have so much to choose from. And that's really the problem. The problem is one of choice. It's having too many options. not having limited options. And so that's where we are with the ideal Beethoven cycle. Thank you for watching. Keep on listening and take care.